Welcome to Dusk and Empires. Tonight, we uncover a haunting secret Lincoln kept close, a dream so vivid, so dark, that he told his closest friends he had already seen his own death before it came. If this sounds like your kind of bedtime story, subscribe before you drift off. Now get comfortable, close your eyes, and let history carry you to sleep. Opening meditation. There is something about the night that opens us. The body grows still. The eyes grow heavy. And somewhere in the soft darkness between waking and sleep, the mind begins to move through corridors that daylight keeps closed. It visits rooms we do not choose. It shows us faces we have not summoned. It speaks in images rather than words, and sometimes, only sometimes, it tells us something true. Tonight, we are going somewhere very specific. We are going to Washington, D.C., in the spring of 1865. To a city that smells of mud and horses and wood smoke. To a time when the great, terrible war that had torn the country apart was finally coming to its end. To the White House, not the gleaming, manicured place it would become, but a building worn down by 4 years of siege, of grief, of impossible decisions made by impossible men in impossible circumstances. And we are going to a particular man, lying in a particular bed, in the deep hours before dawn. A man who was tired in a way that sleep could not quite reach. A man who had carried the weight of 500,000 deaths on his shoulders and somehow kept walking. A man who, one quiet morning, came down to breakfast and told his family and his closest friends about a dream. A dream of a body in the East Room. A dream of sobbing crowds. A dream of soldiers standing guard over a president who would never wake again. He had the dream 10 days before he died. Let yourself settle now. Feel the weight of your body where it rests. Feel the softness of the darkness around you. There is nowhere to be tonight. Nowhere to go. We are only going to listen. Only going to move slowly, gently, through one of the strangest and most quietly haunting stories in all of American history. The story of Abraham Lincoln. His dreams. His premonitions. And the long, strange night of April 14, 1865. Part 1, The Man Who Could Not Stop Dreaming. Close your eyes and imagine a face. Not the face from the monuments, not the granite stillness of the memorial, not the severe formal portrait on the $5 bill. Imagine the actual face. The living one. The one described by everyone who met Abraham Lincoln in person and came away somehow shaken by what they had seen. It was a face of extraordinary sadness. Even when he laughed, and he laughed often, loved to laugh, told jokes at the most peculiar moments, the eyes stayed apart from it. They were gray, or gray-blue, depending on the light, set deeply beneath a heavy brow. His law partner William Herndon said that those eyes had a sad, faraway look, as if gazing into an abyss. Walt Whitman, who passed Lincoln regularly in the streets of Washington during the war years, noted the face with a poet's precision and said he had never seen it laugh. He meant something specific by that. He meant that even in Lincoln's good moments, the underlying architecture of the face was built for sorrow. But what Herndon and Whitman and nearly everyone else also noticed was something stranger than sadness. Something they struggled to name. A quality of distance. A sense that part of Lincoln was always somewhere else, some interior room that no visitor was allowed to enter. And the people who knew him best understood that this quality had something to do with his dreams. Abraham Lincoln was, by any measure, a man of the unconscious. He had been, from childhood, prone to long, silent spells. His father, Thomas Lincoln, a rough, practical frontier man who had little patience for what he considered weakness, would sometimes find young Abraham sitting motionless by the fire for hours, staring at nothing. He was not stupid. He was not simple. He was somewhere else. His stepmother Sarah, who loved him with great uncomplicated warmth, said he would sometimes come out of these reveries with tears on his face and have no explanation for them. He grew up in the raw country of Indiana and later Illinois, in log cabins that smelled of pine resin and damp earth and wood ash, where the nights were very dark and very long and the nearest neighbor might be a mile away through the trees. These were places that invited inwardness. They were places where a person learned to listen to their own mind simply because there was nothing else to listen to. He also knew the landscape of grief with intimate and early familiarity. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, died when he was 9 years old. Milk sickness, they called it, a mysterious wasting disease caused by drinking milk from cows that had fed on white snakeroot. She was 34. The cabin they lived in was cold and small and far from any real medical help. She lingered for about a week. Young Abraham watched her die. They buried her on a hill near the cabin. There was no minister for the funeral. It was months before a traveling preacher came through and said the proper words over her grave. His older sister Sarah, who had become a second mother to him in the aftermath of Nancy's death, died a few years later in childbirth. She was 21. The child died with her. By the time he was in his 20s, Abraham Lincoln had learned something that most people do not learn until much later, if they learn it at all. He had learned that the people you love will simply vanish. One morning they are there, and one morning they are not. And the world goes on turning, indifferent and unchanged, regardless of how necessary they were. This knowledge lived in him. It shaped everything, his humor, which was always tinged with darkness, even in its most rollicking moments. His politics, which were defined by a nearly ferocious commitment to human dignity. And his dreams. Lincoln spoke openly about his dreams in a way that was somewhat unusual for a man of his time and station. Frontier culture was not, on the whole, a culture that encouraged introspective self-disclosure. Men were supposed to be practical, forward-facing, unsentimental. But Lincoln seemed to feel that his dreams carried weight. That they were worth paying attention to. That they told him things. His law partner Herndon, who knew Lincoln better than perhaps anyone outside of his immediate family, noted that Lincoln had what he called a sense of doom, not in a morbid or self-pitying way, but in a more classical sense. A belief that his life was moving toward some appointed destination. That events were not random. That the larger shape of things could sometimes be glimpsed, if you were paying attention. He believed in presentiments, Herndon wrote, years after Lincoln's death. He seemed to feel the weight of coming events before they arrived. And the dreams were part of that. The dreams were not entertainment. They were not to be dismissed over coffee and forgotten by mid-morning. They were, for Lincoln, a form of intelligence about the world. A frequency he could sometimes receive, however imperfectly, however incompletely. There was one dream in particular that came to him again and again throughout the years of the Civil War. A dream of a ship. We will spend more time with this dream later. But for now, know only that it mattered to him. That he watched for it. That when it came, he understood it to mean something significant was approaching. And then there was the other dream. The one he described that morning in April 1865 to his wife and his cabinet members and his friend Ward Hill Lamon. The dream of the White House and the body and the sobbing crowds and the soldiers standing at attention. That dream was not the ship dream. That dream was something entirely different. That dream, he seems to have believed, was about him. To understand why this dream arrived when it did, and why Lincoln received it the way he did, not with panic, but with a kind of careful, watchful gravity, we need to understand the world he was living in. The world of Washington, D.C. in the last weeks of the Civil War. A world stretched so thin between relief and grief that it barely held together. And for that, we need to go back. Not far, only a few weeks. To the beginning of April, 1865, and the beginning of the end. Part 2, the end of a long war. Picture a city that has been holding its breath for 4 years. Washington, D.C., in the spring of 1865 was a place transformed almost beyond recognition from what it had been when Lincoln first arrived there as president-elect in February of 1861. It had become, in the intervening years, something between a fortress and a hospital. The hills around the city bristled with earthworks and cannon batteries, 68 forts and a great ring, built in the terrified weeks after the fall of Fort Sumter, when it seemed quite possible that Confederate forces might march north and take the capital itself. The city smelled, in those years, of something complicated. It smelled of the Potomac River, which was often low and sluggish in summer, and of the thousands of horses that served the army, their dung and their sweat and the leather of their tack. It smelled of the makeshift hospitals that had sprung up everywhere, in churches, in hotels, in private homes, in the patent office itself, where rows of sick and wounded soldiers lay between display cases of inventions, that strange juxtaposition of national ingenuity and human suffering. It smelled of campfire smoke from the encampments on the city's outskirts, where more than 100,000 men had at various times been billeted. It was a city of permanent anxiety. Of rumors. Of information that moved slowly and arrived distorted. Word of a battle might not reach the capital for days, and when it did, the news was often fragmentary, the names of the dead not yet compiled, the scale of the victory or defeat not yet clear. People learned to live with uncertainty the way they learned to live with bad weather. It was simply there, every day, inescapable. And Lincoln lived at the center of all of it. In the White House, which was less a home than a kind of permanent emergency command post. The building itself was not grand by any later standard. The carpets were threadbare. The rooms smelled of tobacco smoke and wood fire and, in summer, of the miasma rising from the marshy ground to the south. There were constant visitors, not just cabinet members and generals, but ordinary citizens who came to ask for help. For a son's pardon. For news of a husband. For a job, a contract, a commission. Lincoln's door was, famously, more open than any other president's. He called these meetings his public opinion baths. He believed in them. He also found them, by his own admission, completely exhausting. He slept badly. He had always slept badly, but the war had made it worse. He ate little. His law partner Herndon had once noted that Lincoln seemed to regard food as merely fuel, consuming it without pleasure and often forgetting it altogether when his mind was occupied. He had grown noticeably thinner during the war years. The photographs tell the story plainly. The man who had taken office in 1861, already thin, had become gaunt by 1865. The lines of his face had deepened. The hollows beneath his eyes had grown more pronounced. And yet he had also, in some strange way, grown into the presidency in a manner that surprised everyone, including himself. He had arrived in Washington widely underestimated. Many of his own cabinet members thought of him as a provincial lawyer, a man of limited sophistication who had been elevated by political accident. William Seward, his Secretary of State, had essentially expected to run the administration himself, to be the actual power behind this unsophisticated figurehead from Illinois. What Seward found instead was a man of extraordinary and patient political intelligence. A man who could hold contradictions without being destroyed by them. A man who could hear the worst possible news: a battle lost, a general failed, 100,000 more casualties, and sit with it, absorb it, and then move to the next question. This was not coldness. Lincoln felt things profoundly. But he had a capacity for continuing in the face of loss that was simply remarkable. By early 1865, the war had clearly shifted. The brutal, grinding campaigns of 1864, the Overland Campaign in Virginia, Sherman's march through Georgia, had exhausted the Confederacy in ways from which it could not recover. General Ulysses Grant had Petersburg, Virginia, under siege, a siege that had lasted 9 months. Richmond, the Confederate capital, was barely 30 miles away and growing increasingly desperate. In early April, the siege broke. On April 1, Union forces won a decisive victory at Five Forks, cutting off the last supply line to Petersburg. On April 2, Confederate General Lee sent word to Confederate President Jefferson Davis that Richmond could not be held. Davis and his government fled the city that same night, loading what government records and valuables they could onto trains in the darkness and vanishing south. On April 3, Union forces entered Richmond. The city was burning. Confederate troops had set fire to the tobacco warehouses and the armory to prevent them falling into Union hands, and the fires had spread. Black residents of the city poured into the streets to welcome the Union soldiers. Some wept. Some sang. Some simply stood and stared at the soldiers with expressions that witnesses described as almost impossible to read, as if the full meaning of what was happening was too large to take in all at once. And on April 4, Abraham Lincoln himself arrived in Richmond. He had been staying, for the final weeks of the campaign, on a steamship called the River Queen, anchored in the James River near Grant's headquarters at City Point, Virginia. Mary Lincoln was with him, and their youngest son Tad. Lincoln had wanted to be close to the action, close to the end, perhaps sensing that something was about to break. He had met with Grant and Sherman and Admiral David Porter in the last days of March for a long conference about how to end the war, and he had been explicit about one thing: he wanted peace, not punishment. He wanted the Confederate soldiers and officers to go home and become citizens again. He wanted this to be over. So it was that Abraham Lincoln walked through the streets of the former Confederate capital. He walked, not in a carriage, not surrounded by an enormous protective detail, but essentially on foot, with a small escort and his 12-year-old son Tad by his side. The streets were full of newly freed black men and women who recognized him immediately, who pressed around him, who reached out to touch him, who knelt before him in gratitude so overwhelming it was almost liturgical. Lincoln was moved deeply. He asked them to rise. He said, quietly, that he was not the one to kneel to. But he accepted their hands. He accepted their blessing. He walked through the burned and smoldering city of Richmond with the deliberate, patient stride of a man who has waited a very long time for a door to open. He stayed in Richmond only a few hours. He visited the Confederate White House, Jefferson Davis's office, where the furniture was still in place, where the fire had been left burning in the grate, where the papers on the desk were only slightly disturbed by the hasty departure. Lincoln sat in Davis's chair. No account records what he said or thought in that moment. He was there very briefly, and then he left. He returned to the River Queen. He was tired in a way that was specific to that moment, not the chronic exhaustion of 4 years of war, but something more pointed. A tiredness that comes when the work is almost done and the body begins, tentatively, to release. And that night, or one of the nights very close to it, the accounts vary slightly in their timelines, Lincoln had the dream. Not the dream of the ship. The other dream. The one about the White House and the mourners and the body in the East Room that looked so much like him. Part 3, The Dream Itself. Ward Hill Lamon had been Lincoln's friend since before the presidency. They had ridden the legal circuit together in Illinois, staying in the same boarding houses, sharing the same rough meals, listening to each other's stories in the lamplight of backcountry taverns. Lamon was physically imposing, large, broad-shouldered, constitutionally protective, and he had appointed himself, without any official title for much of it, Lincoln's personal bodyguard. He worried constantly about the president's safety. He slept, on many occasions, literally outside Lincoln's bedroom door, wrapped in a coat, a pistol at his side. Lincoln teased him for it. He did not take threats to his personal safety seriously, at least not in any way that changed his behavior. He walked through Washington unescorted. He attended the theater without adequate protection. He met with thousands of strangers in his public office hours with no security screening whatsoever. Lamon found this maddening. Lincoln found Lamon's anxiety somewhat touching and somewhat amusing. But it was Lamon to whom Lincoln told the dream. And Lamon who wrote it down, carefully and in detail, years later in his memoir of Lincoln. And because of that, because Lincoln chose to tell it, and Lamon chose to record it, we have it. We know what Lincoln saw that night. This is what Lincoln described. He said he had been sleeping fitfully. This was nothing unusual, fitful sleep was his normal condition. He lay in the darkness for a while, half dreaming, waiting for something. And then, as he put it, he slipped into the land of dreams. In the dream, there was a silence in the White House. An unusual silence. The kind of silence that is not peaceful but oppressive, the silence of something withheld, something wrong. He wandered through the rooms of the White House, or a version of the White House that had the quality of all dream spaces, familiar and strange at once, not quite right in its proportions, its light somehow different from actual daylight. He heard weeping. Distant, muffled weeping. The kind of sound that carries through walls. And he moved toward it, the way one moves toward sound in dreams, without quite deciding to, simply following. He came to the East Room. The East Room is the largest room in the White House. It has been used throughout the building's history for state receptions, for concerts, for formal ceremonies. It is a room of ceremony and display, large, high-ceilinged, lit during Lincoln's era by candles and oil lamps that would throw a warm and trembling light on the plaster cornices and the long windows. In the dream, the East Room was full of people. Soldiers stood at attention around the walls. The crowd was gathered around a catafalque, a raised platform on which a body lay, draped and still, surrounded by mourners. The sound of weeping filled the room, low and continuous, the weeping of a very large number of people, all grief-stricken at once. Lincoln moved through the crowd. He was not recognized, or if recognized, not acknowledged. The strange invisibility of the dreaming self, able to observe but not to participate. He reached the catafalque. He looked at the body. He saw a face wrapped in funeral cloths, and he knew with the certain, terrible knowledge that comes in dreams that this was the President of the United States. He turned to one of the soldiers standing guard and asked, "Who is dead?" "Who is this?" The soldier answered, "The President. The President has been killed by an assassin." And then the sobbing in the room grew louder. And Lincoln woke. He lay in the darkness for a while, he said, with the dream still on him, unable to fall back to sleep. His heart beating in that particular irregular way that comes after a nightmare, not fast, exactly, but present in a way it usually is not. Making itself known. He told Mary about it the next morning. He told Lamon. According to Lamon's account, he gathered a small group of intimate friends and told them together, not as a casual aside but with deliberate seriousness, as if he felt the dream deserved to be witnessed. He described it carefully and completely, leaving nothing out, in the precise and methodical way he had of recounting important things. Mary was disturbed. Mary Lincoln, as we will learn in more detail, had her own complicated relationship with death and premonition and fear. She pressed him to see the dream as ominous. She was frightened by it. Lincoln seems to have occupied a more ambiguous position. He did not dismiss it. He did not say it meant nothing, or that dreams are only the noise of the sleeping mind, or that one ought not to read significance into the night's productions. He was too honest for that, and too thoughtful. But he also noted something important. In the dream, the figure on the catafalque was not clearly identified. The soldier had said the President, but Lincoln had not seen a face, or had not seen it clearly. It was possible, he suggested carefully, that the dead President in the dream was not himself. It was possible the dream referred to some past president, some predecessor. Lamon didn't buy it. Lamon was deeply disturbed by the dream and said so plainly. He urged Lincoln to take it seriously, to take more precautions, to stop attending public events without adequate protection. Lincoln listened, and then did essentially what he always did with Lamon's safety concerns. He acknowledged them with affectionate seriousness, and then went on doing exactly what he had been doing. It was not recklessness. It was something more complicated than that. Lincoln had, over the years of the presidency, developed a particular relationship with the idea of his own death. He had received thousands of death threats. He had read them, and considered them, and concluded rationally, perhaps correctly, that there was very little he could practically do. A truly determined assassin, he believed, could not be stopped. Protection was an illusion. All one could do was carry on. And there was something else. Something harder to articulate. A quality in Lincoln's thinking about his own end that was less like fear and more like recognition. As if he had known, for a long time, at some level below conscious thought, that the story he was living was building toward a particular kind of ending. That there was a body in the East Room waiting. And that it was his. Part 4, A Life Shaped by Shadows. Some lives seem to gather darkness the way certain landscapes gather fog. Not because of fate, exactly, that is too simple a word. More because of a combination of temperament and circumstance and the specific kind of attention a person pays to the world. Lincoln was such a person. The darkness was not something he sought. It was simply something he was unusually open to receiving. We have already spoken of his mother and his sister. But there were other losses. Other shadows that settled over the years and never quite lifted. In his 20s, in New Salem, Illinois, Lincoln fell deeply in love with a young woman named Anne Rutledge. She was the daughter of the tavern keeper in New Salem, and by all accounts a remarkable young woman, intelligent, warm, genuinely well-liked by everyone in the small community. Lincoln was, in those years, a struggling young man of uncertain future, postmaster, store clerk, occasional surveyor, aspiring lawyer, but he had qualities that people recognized. He was intelligent and fundamentally kind and could make anyone laugh. Whether he and Anne Rutledge were formally engaged is a matter historians have debated for more than a century. What is less disputed is that Lincoln cared for her deeply, and that in the summer of 1835, Anne Rutledge died. She was 22 years old. The cause was typhoid fever, probably, or something very similar. The frontier diagnoses of the period were imprecise, and what was called brain fever could cover several actual conditions. She suffered for several weeks before dying, and Lincoln, accounts suggest, was allowed to visit her near the end. What they said to each other in those last days, if anything, is not recorded. After her death, Lincoln fell into the first of what would be several serious episodes of what we would now call depression. The people of New Salem were genuinely worried about him. He did not eat. He could not sleep. He wandered in the woods alone for long periods. There were real concerns, shared openly among his neighbors, that he might harm himself. He had friends in New Salem who essentially watched over him during this period, the same instinct to protect that would resurface in Lamont decades later. They believed his mind was all but gone. He spoke of Anne constantly, returned to her grave, could not seem to accept the fact of her absence in the way that ordinary grief eventually allows acceptance. He recovered. Slowly, imperfectly, but he recovered. He moved to Springfield. He studied law in earnest. He entered politics. He became, over the next decade and a half, one of the most effective lawyers and politicians in Illinois. He married Mary Todd in 1842, a match that was complicated from the beginning, that involved a broken engagement and a period of bitter separation before reconciliation, and that would be, for its entire duration, a marriage of intense emotional turbulence. But also real love. Real partnership. Real mutual recognition of something deep in the other person. They had 4 sons. Robert, the eldest, born in 1843, survived to adulthood and old age. He would live until 1926, outliving the Civil War era entirely and dying in the 20th century, a living connection between two worlds almost too far apart to imagine coexisting. But the other 3 sons died young, and each death left its mark on Lincoln and Mary both. Edward Baker Lincoln Eddie died in 1850 at the age of 3, of what was likely tuberculosis. He had been ill for nearly 2 months. Lincoln was at home during that illness, not away on the legal circuit, and he and Mary sat with their dying child through the long, slow withdrawal of his life. There is a poem Lincoln wrote after Eddie's death, or at least, a poem attributed to him, that speaks of the strange consolation of believing a child had gone somewhere better. It is a grief poem. It is very quiet. It does not resolve. Then there was Willie. William Wallace Lincoln Willie was born in 1850, the same year Eddie died, and he was, by every account, a child of extraordinary quality. Bright, warm, gentle, curious about everything. He was, people said, the most like his father of all the Lincoln children, the same quality of interior depth, the same warmth, the same gentle humor. Lincoln loved all his children, but Willie was special in the way that is difficult to explain without sounding like favoritism. It was more than that. It was recognition. Willie died in February 1862. He was 11 years old. He died of typhoid fever, contracted from the contaminated water supply of Washington, D.C., the same water that fed the White House kitchens and taps. He was ill for about 3 weeks, and for much of that time Lincoln came to sit with him whenever he could be spared from the demands of a war that was, in February of 1862, going very badly for the Union. Lincoln would sit by Willie's bed and read to him, or simply sit in the particular silence of a father beside a sick child, listening to the sound of his breathing, trying to find something in that sound that felt like improvement. Willie died on February 20th. He was laid out in the green room of the White House. Mary Lincoln collapsed with grief and could not rise from her bed for weeks. She never fully recovered from Willie's death, and it accelerated the mental fragility that would mark the rest of her life. Lincoln looked at his dead son for a long time. He said, to a friend who was with him, "My poor boy. He was too good for this earth. God has called him home. I know that he is much better off in heaven, but then we loved him so. It is hard to have him die." He went back to Willie twice after the initial viewing, asking the attendants to unwrap the boy's face so he could look at it again. He could not quite believe it. This is a very human response to the death of someone who should not have died, a child, a young person, someone whose death violates the expected order of things. The mind keeps returning to the face, as if by looking long enough it will find something different. As if the fact might somehow be undone. The war went on, as wars do, regardless of personal grief. And Lincoln went back to his desk and his decisions and his impossible responsibilities, carrying Willie's death inside him like a stone. He would dream of Willie. He would tell people, in the years that followed, that he sometimes felt Willie's presence near him, not as a hallucination, but as a feeling. A warmth. A sense that he was not entirely alone in his work. This is relevant to everything that follows. When Lincoln dreamed of the body in the East Room, he was dreaming as a man who had spent his entire life in close proximity to death. Who had lost his mother and his sister and the woman he first loved and 2 of his 4 children and, by 1865, more than 500,000 soldiers who had died on his watch, whose names filled endless lists that were delivered to his desk in the White House day after day after day. He was not a man who feared death the way someone fears an unknown stranger. He knew death. He had sat with it many times. He had looked at it directly. Perhaps that is why the dream did not destroy him. Why he could tell it over breakfast, carefully and completely, and then go on with his day. He had always known that death was somewhere in the house. Part 5: The Recurring Ship. There was another dream. A dream that Lincoln spoke of far more frequently than the East Room dream, a dream that had come to him many times over the course of the war. A dream he had learned to watch for, and to read. He called it simply the dream. Sometimes the naval dream. He mentioned it to his cabinet members on multiple occasions, always in the same context, at moments when he sensed that a significant military event was approaching. A battle about to break. A campaign about to resolve. A moment of change. The dream involved a ship. A large, strangely built vessel, moving through water. Moving fast, faster than should have been possible, with great and urgent speed, toward a dark and indefinite shore. That was Lincoln's phrase. The dark and indefinite shore. It had the quality, he said, of something that lay beyond ordinary geography, not quite a real coastline, but a destination nonetheless. A place toward which the ship was moving, regardless of what anyone might wish. He could not explain clearly what the ship meant or what the shore was. When pressed, and his cabinet members did press him, curious and perhaps a little unsettled, he would say only that the dream seemed to be a signal. A sign that something important was coming. Not necessarily good or bad, but significant. A turn. He had the dream before Bull Run. Before Antietam. Before Gettysburg. Before several other major engagements of the war that he had not yet been officially informed of when the dream arrived, as if the dream somehow preceded the news. As if whatever transmitted the intelligence of events to the sleeping mind worked faster than a telegraph. On the morning of April 14, 1865, the last morning of his life, Lincoln had a cabinet meeting. The meeting was attended by his principal cabinet members and by General Ulysses Grant, who had arrived in Washington the day before. The mood in the room was a peculiar mixture of the businesslike and the triumphant. Lee had surrendered at Appomattox just 5 days earlier, on April 9, and the end of the war was now not a matter of calculation but of fact. There was still work to do. Other Confederate forces had not yet formally surrendered, and the reconstruction of the South was a massive problem that had barely been begun, but the great terrible thing was over. The shooting was mostly over. The country was going to survive. At some point during this morning meeting, Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles asked about news from General Sherman, who was in the Carolinas and expected to report the final surrender of the last major Confederate army there. No word had arrived yet. Lincoln said that good news would come soon. He said he was sure of it. And when Welles asked how he could be sure, Lincoln said, because of the dream. He told the cabinet about the ship moving through the water, very fast, toward that dark and indefinite shore. He had had the dream again last night, he said. He always had it before great events. Before great victories. Grant was present for this. Grant, who was the most unsentimental of men, who had driven himself and his armies through some of the most brutal fighting of the entire war with a cold mechanical patience that unnerved his enemies and sometimes his allies, listened to the president describe his recurring dream and said nothing dismissive. He did not correct him or laugh. He simply listened. There was something about Lincoln that made even the most practical men receive his accounts of dreams with a certain respect. It was not that they necessarily believed in the prophetic power of dreams. It was that they trusted Lincoln's intelligence so thoroughly that when he said something was significant, they assumed there was a reason, even if they could not quite identify it. The meeting went on. The day went on. And Lincoln, still carrying the dream of the ship, went about the last morning of his life. He did not know, of course, that it was the last morning. No one knows that. Every last morning looks like an ordinary morning. The light comes through the windows the same way it always does. The coffee is the same. The mail arrives. But what Lincoln did know, or seemed to know, in that deep pre-verbal register that the dream mind operates in, was that something was moving. Something was approaching the dark and indefinite shore. And he was on the ship. Part 6, The World That Wanted Him Dead. To understand what happened on the night of April 14, 1865, we need to understand the specific geography of hatred that surrounded Abraham Lincoln. Because the dream did not arrive in a vacuum. The premonitions did not emerge from nowhere. They were, in some sense, a response to a real and measurable danger that had been present for years and that Lincoln was not oblivious to, whatever his surface attitude suggested. From the moment Lincoln was elected president in November 1860, there were people who wanted him dead. This is not hyperbole. This is documented fact. The election of 1860 had been a rupture, not just a political defeat for the South, but an existential challenge to the entire social and economic order that the Southern states had built on the labor of enslaved people. Lincoln had not run on an abolitionist platform exactly, but he had run on a platform that included the containment of slavery, no expansion of slavery into new territories, and the South understood, correctly, that containment was the beginning of the end. Before Lincoln even reached Washington to take office, there was a documented assassination plot in Baltimore. The scheme was discovered by Alan Pinkerton, the Scottish-born detective who had established the country's first major private detective agency and who was doing security work for the railroad that was to carry Lincoln to the capital. Pinkerton uncovered what appeared to be a plan to assassinate Lincoln as his train passed through Baltimore, where large and hostile crowds were expected. Lincoln was persuaded, with considerable difficulty, to change his travel plans. He passed through Baltimore at night, in secret, on a different train, and arrived in Washington in the early morning hours without fanfare. He was wearing a soft felt hat and a shawl. The newspapers, who did not know what had happened, initially reported this as Lincoln sneaking into the Capitol in disguise, and they were somewhat mocking about it. Lincoln himself found the whole episode more embarrassing than frightening. He disliked having given the impression of sneaking. He felt it was beneath the dignity of the moment. But the threat was real. The Baltimore plot may or may not have been as fully formed as Pinkerton believed, but it represented something genuine, the depth and specificity of the hatred directed at this new president before he had even taken a single official action. Over the 4 years of the war, the threats multiplied. Lincoln received hundreds of letters threatening his life, some vague, some very specific, some written in a fever of political rage, some cold and methodical. His secretaries, John Hay and John Nicolay, maintained a folder of these letters that they called the OAK file, for oath alleging kill, apparently the grim bureaucratic containment of something that could not really be contained. Lincoln looked at these letters. He did not look at all of them, the sheer volume made that impossible, but he looked at enough to know the character of the threat. He kept a few in his desk. He was not frightened exactly, but he was informed. He knew the landscape. What he did not know, or did not know in full, was the specific plot that was developing in the spring of 1865. The plot centered on a young man from Maryland named John Wilkes Booth. Booth was 26 years old in the spring of 1865. He was an actor, not a minor one, but a genuinely celebrated performer from one of the most famous theatrical families in America. His father, Junius Brutus Booth, had been a major star of the American stage. His brother Edwin Booth was widely considered the greatest Shakespearean actor of his generation. John Wilkes was talented too, physically striking, dark-haired, magnetic, capable of commanding an audience's attention the way performers of that kind can, that particular mixture of presence and technique that looks effortless but is not. He was also a passionate, furious Confederate sympathizer. He had not served in the Confederate Army. His mother had extracted a promise from him early in the war, and he had honored it, though it shamed him, but his emotional allegiance was total. He believed in the Confederate cause with the burning completeness of someone who has never had to test their beliefs against the actual experience of combat. He loved the South's self-image as a land of aristocratic dignity and natural order, and he hated Lincoln with the particular vehemence of someone who holds another person personally responsible for the destruction of everything they love. By late 1864, Booth had assembled a small group of conspirators with a plan. The plan, initially, was not assassination. It was kidnapping. Booth intended to capture Lincoln, to seize him while he was traveling in spirit himself to Richmond, where he would be held as a hostage to force the Union to release Confederate prisoners of war. This was the original scheme, and it was not entirely without a certain dark operational logic, however unlikely its execution. The plan failed repeatedly. Lincoln's movements changed. The opportunities that Booth had identified did not materialize in the forms he had imagined. And then, in April 1865, everything changed. Richmond fell. Lee surrendered. The Confederacy was collapsing. Hostages and negotiations were now irrelevant. Booth's plan shifted to something simpler and more terrible. If the South could not be saved, its enemies could at least be punished. He decided to kill Lincoln and Vice President Andrew Johnson and Secretary of State William Seward, all in the same night. He believed wildly, incorrectly, but with absolute conviction that the simultaneous removal of the Union's leadership would somehow destabilize the government and allow the South to continue the fight. The night he chose was April 14, 1865. He chose it because of the theater. Because he learned, on that day, that Lincoln would be attending a performance at Ford's Theater that evening. Because Ford's Theater was a building Booth knew intimately, he had performed there many times, he had friends among the staff, he had complete freedom of movement within it. It was, in a sense, his territory, his world. And he intended to use it. He spent the day of April 14 moving through Washington with a kind of strange, contained energy. He visited Ford's Theater in the morning, checking the presidential box where Lincoln would sit. He arranged the door. He spoke to various people, employees of the theater, members of his conspiracy, with the surface ease of a man running ordinary errands, while underneath, the machinery of what he had decided turned steadily and relentlessly toward the evening. Lincoln, meanwhile, was having a day that mixed the ordinary with the extraordinary in the way that last days so often seem to, in retrospect. He received visitors. He met with his cabinet. He spoke of Reconstruction, of the work to come, of his desire for reconciliation. He was in relatively good spirits. The relief of the war's ending had given him something that people noticed. A lightness that had not been present for years. He did not particularly want to go to the theater that night. He was tired. He found the obligation of public appearances, being seen, performing the normalcy that the public needed to witness, draining, and tonight he felt the pull of simply being home, simply being quiet. But the appearance had been announced. The public expected it. And General Grant, who had been expected to attend, had sent his regrets. Grant and his wife had decided to travel to New Jersey to see their children, and they had left Washington that afternoon. Lincoln went anyway. With Mary. With a young couple, Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée Clara Harris, who were substitutes for the Grants. He arrived at Ford's Theater to a standing ovation. The orchestra played "Hail to the Chief." He acknowledged the crowd from the presidential box, that particular box on the right side of the stage, decorated with bunting and American flags for the occasion, and then settled in to watch the play. The play was Our American Cousin. It was a comedy. It was popular. It was, by all accounts, going quite well that evening. The audience was in a good mood, the performers were energized, there was something celebratory in the air of the whole city, not just the theater, that spilled into the performances and the reactions of the crowd. Lincoln watched. He laughed at the right moments. By several accounts, he laughed quite heartily at one point, leaning forward in his chair. He was, in those last minutes, in a good moment. A real one. At approximately 10:15 in the evening, John Wilkes Booth opened the door to the presidential box and shot Abraham Lincoln in the back of the head. Part 7, The Night Itself. There is a quality to catastrophe that witnesses always remark on afterward. The way time seems to dislocate. The way sounds and images arrive with a strange clarity that feels almost unreal, too sharp, too bright, as if the mind, in its emergency, has tuned every sense to a heightened pitch. The people in Ford's Theater that night experienced this in their various ways. Some did not immediately understand what had happened. The sound of a small pistol fired at close range in a large theater was not, in that moment, the unmistakable thing it would become in retrospect. Some people thought it was part of the play. Some thought a set piece had fallen. The smoke from the pistol drifted into the theater air. And then Booth leaped from the box to the stage. He was a trained athlete, a physically capable man, and he might have made a clean landing, except that the spur of his boot caught in the bunting that decorated the box, and he came down awkwardly, fracturing a bone in his left leg. He stumbled, rose, and faced the audience. He said something. Witnesses disagreed about exactly what. Some heard sic semper tyrannis, the Latin phrase meaning thus always to tyrants, the motto of the Commonwealth of Virginia, the phrase attributed to Brutus at the assassination of Caesar. Some heard the South is avenged. Some heard both, in some order. In the confusion and the noise and the gathering horror of the room, the words blurred. He ran. Across the stage, through the wings, out the back door to a waiting horse. He rode south into the Maryland night, his fractured leg beginning to swell in his boot, the city erupting behind him in alarm and confusion. In the presidential box, Major Rathbone had been stabbed in the arm trying to stop Booth, a savage, deep wound to the upper arm that had bled profusely. Mary Lincoln was screaming. Clara Harris was trying to help, to do something, in the paralyzed way of someone whose body has outrun their comprehension of events. Lincoln was unconscious. He would never regain consciousness. The ball from Booth's pistol had entered at the back of the left side of his skull and lodged behind his right eye. It was a wound that, given the medical knowledge of 1865, was not survivable. It was not survivable under any circumstances that then existed. The question from the moment it was inflicted was not whether Lincoln would die but how long the dying would take. There was a doctor in the audience, Dr. Charles Leal, a young army surgeon who was 23 years old and had, in the years of the war, developed considerable experience with traumatic wounds. He was in the theater that night specifically to see Lincoln. He had never been close to the president before and had wanted to observe him. He reached the box quickly. He examined the wound. He was experienced enough to understand its nature immediately. Lincoln was carried from the theater. There was discussion about where to take him. The White House was several blocks away, and the doctors who gathered quickly concluded that he could not survive the journey without more immediate intervention. A man named William Peterson, who lived in a boarding house directly across the street from Ford's Theater, opened his door. Lincoln was carried inside, through the narrow entrance hall, into a small bedroom at the back of the ground floor. The bed was too short for him. Lincoln was 6 feet 4 inches tall, and the bed in the Peterson house was an ordinary bed, sized for an ordinary man. The doctors placed him diagonally across it, on his back, his long limbs awkward in the small space. And then they sent for Mary. And sent for the cabinet. And the long vigil of the night began. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton arrived relatively quickly and took charge of the scene with the decisive administrative energy that was his great characteristic. The Peterson house became, in the course of that extraordinary night, simultaneously a medical station, a command post, and a place of grief. Messages went out to all parts of the city and beyond. Witnesses to the shooting were gathered and questioned. The manhunt for Booth and his co-conspirators was organized. The machinery of the state continued to function even in the midst of the catastrophe that had struck at its center. Mary Lincoln spent most of the night in the front parlor of the Peterson house. She was allowed into the room where Lincoln lay at intervals, but her distress was so acute she wept and cried out and tried to touch him and had to be repeatedly restrained that the doctors found her presence complicated their work. Robert Lincoln, summoned from wherever he had been that evening, arrived and sat with his mother and then with his father, going back and forth between the two small rooms, trying to be in two places at once in the way that adult children do in family emergencies. The night was cold and clear. Outside the Peterson house, a crowd gathered and grew throughout the night. People who did not know exactly what had happened stood in the street, keeping a vigil that was part hope and part grief and part the simple human need to be near something important when it happens. They stood in the dark and waited. Inside, the doctors maintained their watch. Lincoln's breathing was audible, a slow, heavy, stertorous breathing that the physicians recognized as the characteristic respiration of a deep brain injury. They had seen it before, in the field hospitals of the war. They knew what it meant. But they watched, and they recorded, and they noted every change, because that was what they knew how to do. Because watching was not nothing, even when there was nothing to be done. Secretary Stanton sat in the room for much of the night. He was a complicated man, abrasive, demanding, sometimes cruel in his administrative style, but his devotion to Lincoln and to the Union cause was complete. He watched Lincoln lying on the small bed, the great irregular breathing filling the small room, the lamps burning low, and he was not a man who showed emotion easily or often. By early morning, it was clear that the end was very close. At 7:22 in the morning of April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln died. The room was full. The cabinet members, the doctors, the ministers, Robert Lincoln, they all stood in the low morning light in that small room. And when the breathing stopped, and the silence settled, Secretary Stanton, hard, unsentimental, practical Stanton, looked at the face of his dead president and said words that became some of the most famous in American history. "Now he belongs to the ages." Some accounts record it as, "Now he belongs to the angels." The distinction has been debated by historians ever since. The original note-taker present was using pencil. The word looks similar either way. But the weight of it is the same. The man who had been Lincoln was gone. Whatever had been Lincoln, that particular combination of mind and heart and language and suffering and compassion and humor and grief, was finished. And what remained was the body. The myth. The memory. The endless interpretation. Part 8, The East Room. After Lincoln's death, his body was returned to the White House. Not immediately, there were the necessary preparations, the embalming, which was a practice still relatively new in America but had become more common during the war, when the bodies of soldiers needed to be preserved for transport home from distant battlefields. And then, when these preparations were complete, Lincoln was brought back to the house he had lived in for 4 years. He was laid in state in the East Room. The East Room. The room from the dream. The catafalque was constructed and placed in the center of the room. Lincoln lay upon it, dressed in the black suit he had worn at his second inauguration just 6 weeks before. The room was hung with black crepe. The mirrors were covered, as was the custom. The gas lights were turned low. Soldiers stood at attention around the walls. And the mourners came. They came in thousands. In tens of thousands. The doors of the White House were opened and the lines stretched down Pennsylvania Avenue, around corners, into the distance. People had come from all over the city and from surrounding towns and farms. They came because they needed to see. Because the news that Lincoln had been shot, that Lincoln was dead, was simply too large to accept at a distance. The mind needs the body. The body makes the fact real in a way that words alone cannot. The scene was exactly, precisely, hauntingly exactly, what Lincoln had described in his dream. The catafalque. The soldiers. The weeping crowds. The East Room. Ward Lamon, who had heard Lincoln describe the dream only 10 days before, and who had been so disturbed by it that he had urged Lincoln to take more precautions, now stood in the East Room and saw the dream made real. He wrote about it afterward with a directness that carries the weight of genuine shock. He had believed the dream was a warning. He had not been able to make Lincoln take it seriously enough to change his habits, his movements, his willingness to appear in public without adequate protection. And now here was the fulfillment. He was not the only one who made the connection. Mary Lincoln, in her devastating grief, returned to the dream again and again in the weeks and months that followed. She spoke of it to friends and correspondents as proof that Lincoln had known. That he had been warned. That something in him had been given the knowledge of what was coming and had tried, in the language of dreams, to prepare himself and those around him. Whether this interpretation is correct, whether the dream was genuinely prophetic in the classical sense, a visitation of actual foreknowledge is not a question that admits of a simple answer. We will return to it. But what is undeniable is the symmetry. The dream described the East Room scene in specific detail. And 10 days later, the East Room scene was exactly as the dream had shown it. There is a word for this kind of coincidence that is too specific to feel like coincidence, and the word is uncanny. From the German word unheimlich, unhomely, the thing that is familiar but wrong, the thing that belongs to a world that operates by slightly different rules than the one we normally inhabit. The dream was uncanny. The fulfillment of it was uncanny. And Lincoln himself, in many ways, was uncanny, a figure who seemed to exist at the intersection of the ordinary and the extraordinary, the practical and the prophetic, the entirely explicable and the deeply mysterious. The public viewing of Lincoln's body lasted 2 days. On April 19, there was a state funeral in the East Room, attended by President Andrew Johnson, who had been sworn in just hours after Lincoln's death, in a ceremony in a hotel room with a hastily gathered group of witnesses, and by cabinet members and officials and dignitaries from across the country. Mary Lincoln was too grief-stricken to attend. And then Lincoln's body began its journey home. The funeral train carried him from Washington to Springfield, Illinois, retracing in reverse much of the route he had traveled as president-elect 4 years before. The journey took nearly 2 weeks. The train stopped at major cities along the way: Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, Cleveland, Columbus, Indianapolis, Chicago, and in each city, Lincoln's coffin was removed and placed on display so that the people of that city could file past and say goodbye. The crowds were immense. In New York City, an estimated 100,000 people lined the streets as the funeral cortege passed. In smaller towns and cities, people came from the surrounding countryside for hours to be present. And at many of the rural stops along the route, where the train did not stop, where there was no ceremony planned, people simply stood. Farmers and their families, workers, children. Standing by the tracks in the April twilight, hats in their hands, watching the funeral train pass. Willie Lincoln's body traveled with his father. Willie, who had been buried temporarily in a borrowed vault in Washington, was now to be interred in Springfield alongside Abraham. Father and son, making the journey home together. The train arrived in Springfield on May 3. Lincoln was laid to rest at Oak Ridge Cemetery, in the Illinois Spring, under the same sky that had been above him when he was young and unknown and riding the legal circuit and dreaming of whatever lay ahead. Part 9: Mary and the Meaning of Grief. If Lincoln's death was devastating to the country, it was something beyond devastation for Mary Lincoln. It was, in the most literal sense, the destruction of her world. She had already been living for 3 years in the aftermath of Willie's death, and she had never recovered from that. She had, in the months after Willie died, turned to spiritualism, to the mediums and seances and table-rapping sessions that were enormously popular in the mid-19th century, a cultural phenomenon that swept through both Britain and America and drew in people from all levels of society, including many educated and otherwise skeptical individuals. Mary held seances in the White House. She communicated, she believed, with Willie. She received comfort from this, real comfort, whatever one makes of the metaphysics. Lincoln apparently attended at least one of these seances, though his attitude toward them was characteristically ambiguous. He was not conventionally religious. He was not conventionally skeptical either. He seems to have approached the question of what survives death, if anything survives, with the same open-minded watchfulness that he applied to his own dreams. He did not rule it out. He did not endorse it. He sat with the uncertainty. But after Lincoln's death, Mary's grief was total and consuming. She could not leave her bedroom in the White House for 5 weeks. She could not attend her husband's funeral. She lay in the darkness and wept and could not eat and could barely speak. The sounds of hammering, the hammering as the workmen built the platform for the public viewing, came through the walls, and she could not escape them. When she finally left the White House, she did not return to Springfield. She was estranged from Springfield society, which had never fully accepted her as one of its own. She was considered proud, difficult, overly expensive in her tastes. She moved instead to Chicago, with her son Robert and her youngest son Tad. She was, by this point, in a condition that we would now recognize as severe and prolonged major depression, complicated by grief and trauma and the financial anxiety that haunted her throughout her widowhood. She had, on the night of Lincoln's assassination, still been wearing her dress when she returned to her room at the White House in the dawn hours after his death. She could not take it off. She left it on for weeks. The financial circumstances that followed Lincoln's death were genuinely difficult in ways that the public did not fully understand. Lincoln had not been a wealthy man. He had managed his money carefully enough, but the presidency paid modestly, and the expenses of the White House, which the president's family was expected to cover from their own salaries in many respects, had consumed much of what he earned. Mary received a portion of Lincoln's estate and eventually a congressional pension, but she felt perpetually on the edge of financial ruin, and this fear was not entirely irrational. She also dealt with something more diffuse and more corrosive: public opinion. Mary had been a controversial figure throughout the White House years. She had been criticized for her spending, real and exaggerated. She had been criticized for her White House receptions, which some felt were too grand for a time of national mourning. She had been accused, because she was from Kentucky and had brothers in the Confederate Army, of Confederate sympathies, a charge that was both painful and deeply unjust. She had been lampooned in the press and gossiped about in the Washington social world. After Lincoln's death, the criticism did not stop. It shifted focus but continued. She was criticized for the length of her mourning, for the depth of her grief, which some found excessive or performative. She was criticized for attending additional spiritualist sessions, for seeking contact with Lincoln's spirit as she had sought contact with Willie's. She was criticized for eventually entering into an ill-conceived scheme to sell some of her clothing and jewelry in New York, which became a humiliating public spectacle. Tad Lincoln, her youngest and most beloved remaining child, died in 1871 at the age of 18. The cause was likely tuberculosis or something similar. He had been a particular light in Mary's life, physically frail and somewhat behind in his development, but warm and lively and joyful in the way that children who have grown up inside the White House sometimes are, surrounded by enormity and somehow untouched by it. His death was the blow from which Mary never recovered. In 1875, Robert Lincoln, out of a complex mixture of genuine concern and, it has to be said, a certain embarrassment about his mother's increasingly erratic behavior, had her committed to a private mental institution in Illinois. The commitment was brief, and Mary was released after a few months and declared competent by a second court proceeding, but the damage to her relationship with Robert was permanent and severe. She spent most of her remaining years in France, in a kind of self-imposed exile, living in a succession of hotels and rented rooms, gradually growing more physically fragile. She returned to the United States in 1880, in the last year of her life. She spent her final months in the care of her sister Elizabeth in Springfield, the same Springfield from which Lincoln had once left for the presidency, the same town where he was buried. She spent most of those months in a darkened room, partially paralyzed, her eyesight failing, her body preparing itself for the end. She died on July 16, 1882, 17 years after her husband. She was 63 years old. She was buried beside Abraham and Willie and Tad at Oak Ridge Cemetery, in the tomb that had been built for Lincoln after his assassination. The family was complete again, in the way that families are complete in marble and stone, all the gaps finally closed, all the absences finally made solid and permanent. What Mary Lincoln had carried, for all those years, was the memory of the dream. Lincoln's dream of the East Room. The dream that had come 10 days before his death and that she had spent the rest of her life understanding, or trying to understand, as the warning that had not been heeded in time. Part 10: The Man with the Gun. John Wilkes Booth did not escape for long. He crossed into Maryland on the night of the assassination, his fractured leg in agony, riding through the dark with David Harold, a young, somewhat dim co-conspirator who served mainly as a guide through the countryside. They stopped at the farm of Dr. Samuel Mudd, who set Booth's leg. Mudd later claimed he did not know who his patient was, a claim that historians have debated with considerable vigor ever since. What is not debated is that Booth left Mudd's farm with his leg splinted and continued moving south. For 12 days after the assassination, Booth was a fugitive. He and Harold hid in swamps and barns and isolated farmhouses, moving by night when they could, dependent on Confederate sympathizers in the Maryland and Virginia countryside for food and shelter and guidance. Booth was in pain. The leg was worsening, by the end he could barely walk. He had expected, somehow, to be received as a hero in the South. He had expected acclaim and gratitude for what he had done. This act that he had convinced himself was both necessary and historically glorious. What he found instead was a countryside deeply unsettled by the assassination. Even those who had supported the Confederacy were not, for the most part, celebrating the death of Lincoln. The more thoughtful among them understood that a living Lincoln, who had spoken publicly and repeatedly of Reconstruction with malice toward none, might actually have been better for the defeated South than whatever followed. The harder men of the Republican Party, the radical Republicans who wanted punishment and retribution, would now have far more influence over what came next. The war Booth had loved and mourned was over. The cause he had believed in was defeated. And his dramatic act had changed nothing except the individual life it had taken and the individual lives it had shattered. The Union Army found him on April 26. He and Harold had taken shelter in a tobacco barn on a farm near Port Royal, Virginia, belonging to a man named Richard Garrett. Soldiers surrounded the barn in the night. Harold surrendered. Booth refused. The soldiers set the barn on fire. In the light of the burning barn, a soldier named Boston Corbett, a deeply religious, somewhat erratic former hatmaker, shot Booth through the neck. The shot was unauthorized. Corbett said afterward that God had told him to do it. Booth was dragged from the burning barn. He died on the porch of the Garrett farmhouse as dawn was breaking, paralyzed by the wound to his spine. His last words, by some accounts, were, "Tell my mother I died for my country. I did what I thought was best." In his final moments, it is said he asked to have his hands raised so he could look at them. He looked at his hands. And he said, "Useless. Useless." The co-conspirators were captured within days. The assassination of Andrew Johnson, planned for the same night as Lincoln's killing, had been carried out by a man named George Atzerodt who lost his nerve and went to a hotel bar instead. William Seward, the Secretary of State, had been attacked in his home by Lewis Powell, a physically powerful young man who brutally stabbed Seward and several members of his household, wounding Seward severely but failing to kill him. Seward survived, though he bore the scars of that night for the rest of his life. The conspirators who were captured, Powell, Atzerodt, Harold, and a woman named Mary Surratt who had provided logistical support, were tried by a military tribunal in the summer of 1865. They were convicted. They were hanged on July 7, 1865, in the yard of the old Arsenal Penitentiary in Washington, in a ceremony that drew a crowd in the summer heat. Dr. Samuel Mudd and several others received prison sentences. There were appeals, pardons, controversies that stretched on for years. The question of who bore guilt, how much guilt, and of what kind, did not resolve easily or quickly. John Wilkes Booth's body was eventually returned to his family and buried in Baltimore. His grave, in the Greenmount Cemetery, does not bear his name on the family monument. The family chose not to mark it, out of shame and grief. He lies there unnamed. A blank. He was 26 years old when he died. He had wanted to be remembered. He had wanted, in his strange, self-dramatizing way, to be a historical figure, a man who had done something that would be spoken of for centuries. He had read too much Shakespeare and too much classical history and had arrived at a catastrophically wrong conclusion about what kind of story he was living. He is remembered, but not as he imagined. He is remembered as the man who killed Abraham Lincoln, as the agent of one of the most consequential acts of violence in American history, as the man who took from the country a leader it desperately needed at the moment it needed him most. History remembered him, yes, but not in the way he had dreamed. Part 11, The Prophetic Mind, Dreams, Premonitions, and the Mystery of Lincoln's Inner Life. There is a question that has followed the story of Lincoln's dream for 160 years, and it does not resolve into a clean answer no matter how many times it is examined. The question is this: what was Lincoln dreaming, and why? Was the dream prophetic in the strict sense, a genuine foreknowledge of future events, delivered through the sleeping mind by some mechanism we do not understand and cannot explain? Or was it something else, a product of deep anxiety, of a man under enormous stress whose unconscious mind had been calculating threats for years and had simply arrived at a probable conclusion? Or was it something in between, not prophecy exactly, but a kind of accumulated intelligence, a gathering of known facts and sensed probabilities into an image that turned out, with terrible precision, to be correct? These are not small questions. They open onto some of the deepest mysteries of human consciousness, of the nature of time, of the relationship between mind and event. And they were questions that Lincoln himself seems to have sat with very deliberately, without forcing them to a resolution they could not honestly sustain. Lincoln's relationship with the prophetic was complex and well documented. He was not a simple believer in the supernatural in the way that many of his era were. He had grown up in a religious tradition, the Baptist frontier faith of his parents, but had moved away from institutional religion as a young man and never fully returned to it. He did not, as an adult, claim a personal relationship with a God who communicated directly through visions or commands. He was too honest and too intellectually rigorous for that kind of certainty. But he was also too intellectually honest to dismiss what he could not explain. He had experienced too many things, too many moments where a dream or a premonition had preceded an event, too many times when the night mind had shown him something that the day mind later confirmed, to file it all under the category of coincidence and move on. His friend and law partner William Herndon spent decades after Lincoln's assassination collecting testimonies from people who had known Lincoln, gathering the raw material for what would eventually become one of the most important Lincoln biographies of the 19th century. And one of the themes that emerged consistently from Herndon's interviews was this quality of premonition in Lincoln. Person after person noted it. Some found it unsettling. Some found it in retrospect simply, heartbreakingly poignant. There is a story that Herndon collected from Lincoln's early years in Springfield that speaks directly to this quality. Lincoln was riding with a companion on a clear day when he suddenly fell silent and grew pale. His companion asked what was wrong. Lincoln said he had just seen something, a vision, a mental image that had come to him without warning, of himself lying dead. Not in a dream, but waking. Just a flash, a sudden image, clear and complete. He shook his head and rode on, and in a few minutes he seemed himself again. But the companion remembered it. They all remembered these moments, because there was something about them that did not feel like ordinary musing or idle worry. There was a specificity to them. Oh wait. This kind of experience, what psychologists now sometimes call a hypnagogic or hypnopompic hallucination, an image that arrives at the edge of sleep or waking, is not as rare as we might think. Many people experience something like it. Soldiers in war zones report it with some frequency, their nervous systems primed by danger to produce vivid anticipatory images. People under extreme chronic stress report it. People who have experienced severe repeated losses report it. Lincoln was all of these things. He was a man who had known danger, not just the impersonal danger of wartime decisions, but the very specific danger of personal threat. He had received thousands of death threats. He had been told, directly and repeatedly by Pinkerton and by Stanton and by Lamon, that the danger to his life was real and ongoing. Some part of his mind had been holding this information for years, processing it, calculating it, even when the conscious mind was occupied with cabinet meetings and legislation and the endless stream of visitors. And then there are the coincidences. The specific coincidences of the East Room dream that go beyond the general. Not just a dream of dying, which any man under death threat might have. Not just a dream of a crowd, or a dream of mourning. But the East Room specifically. The catafalque. The soldiers. The weeping. The specific architecture of a White House state funeral. These details suggest something that was not merely anxiety. They suggest a mind that had, consciously or otherwise, worked out the specific shape of how such an event would occur. Lincoln knew the White House. He knew that when a president died in office, the body would be laid out in the East Room. This had been done before, for William Henry Harrison, who had died in office in 1841, the president before Lincoln's predecessor James Polk. He knew the tradition. He knew the ceremonies of presidential death in a way that most people, who do not live in the White House, do not. So in one sense, the dream was drawing on real knowledge. Real understanding of how things would unfold. The dream mind was not inventing an entirely new scenario. It was assembling known pieces into a complete image. But there is still the question of timing. The dream came 10 days before Lincoln was killed. It did not come a year earlier, or a month, or the day after the Baltimore plot was discovered. It came 10 days before the specific event, at a moment when the specific threat from Booth was in active preparation. And this is where the explanation based purely on anxiety and assembled knowledge begins to feel insufficient. Because Lincoln could not have known about Booth's specific plans. There is no evidence that any conscious part of his mind had information about Booth that would have made the timing of the dream explicable in ordinary terms. So we are left with the mystery. And perhaps the most honest thing that can be said about it is simply this: Lincoln himself did not pretend to resolve it. He told the dream. He described it completely and carefully. He acknowledged its strangeness and its weight. He did not claim it was definitive prophecy. He did not claim it was mere noise. He held the uncertainty and he watched, and he continued to live in the open way that he had always lived, moving through the world without the protection that might have changed what happened. There is a word in several spiritual traditions for this quality, this watchful, undefended openness to whatever is coming. In some traditions it is called surrender. In others it is called trust. In Lincoln's particular secular and literary vocabulary, it might have been called something else, a belief in necessity. A sense that what was meant to happen would happen, and that one's task was not to prevent the inevitable but to meet it with whatever dignity and purpose one could manage. He had written, in one of his most remarkable political documents, the Second Inaugural Address, delivered just 6 weeks before his death, about the will of God as something that transcends human planning and human understanding. He had written that both sides in the Civil War had prayed to the same God and each had expected God to support them, and that the Almighty had His own purposes, distinct from what either side desired. This was not a comfortable theology. It was not the theology of a man who believed the universe was organized for human convenience. It was the theology of a man who had learned, over a lifetime, to live with the weight of things he could not control. The dream, perhaps, was of a piece with all of this. Not a warning to be acted on. Not a fate to be escaped. Simply the truth, arriving in the night, in the form that the night could deliver. The ship moving toward the dark and indefinite shore. The body in the East Room. The soldiers standing guard. There is one more dimension of this mystery worth sitting with before we move on. It involves something that has been noted by several historians and that touches on the question of what Lincoln himself believed about death and what follows it. Lincoln had, by the spring of 1865, been surrounded by death for so long, not just personal death but the industrial-scale death of the Civil War, the death of hundreds of thousands of young men, that his relationship with mortality had become something quite different from the ordinary person's fear of a distant unknown. He had visited the hospitals. He had walked through the wards and spoken with the wounded and the dying. He had received the casualty lists. He had signed the pardons of condemned soldiers and then, on other days, confirmed executions. He had also, in his more private moments, spoken and written about his own death with a directness that was not morbid but was something more like philosophical preparation. He had said, more than once in the later years of the presidency, that he did not expect to survive his second term. Not as a complaint. Not as a resignation. Simply as an assessment. As if the same quality of mind that made him an unusually accurate reader of political situations had turned itself, with the same clarity, toward his own future and arrived at a particular conclusion. His friend Joshua Speed, the man with whom Lincoln had shared a room above a store in Springfield in the late 1830s, one of the deepest friendships of Lincoln's life, visited the White House during the war years and noted something that stayed with him. Lincoln was calmer about the prospect of his own death than Speed felt was natural. Not hopeless. Not seeking death. But not fighting against the knowledge of it either. As if he had arrived at some kind of interior agreement with the fact. The dream of the East Room may have been, for Lincoln, something like a confirmation of what he already sensed. The night mind showing him, in its specific visual language, what the day mind had long suspected. He had seen the body. He had recognized the face without quite seeing the face, in the way of dreams. And he had come to breakfast and eaten his eggs and told his wife and his friends about it, and then gone on with his day. Part 12, What Remains? There is something that happens to historical figures of a certain magnitude. They do not stay in the past where we put them. They keep arriving in the present. They keep speaking in ways that seem, uncannily, to address the moment we are living in. They become not just historical subjects but something closer to companions, presences that the culture returns to again and again, looking for something, finding something different each time depending on what the era needs. Abraham Lincoln is the most extreme example of this phenomenon in American history. No other figure has been so continuously invoked, so variously interpreted, so persistently present in the national conversation about who Americans are and what they aspire to be. Presidents have read him. movements have claimed him. Every side of nearly every major argument in American politics has, at some point, tried to enlist him as a supporter. This is partly because he left behind a body of writing and speaking of genuine literary greatness, the Gettysburg Address, the second inaugural address, scores of letters and speeches that achieved the compression and density of great poetry. These texts do what great writing always does: they stay alive past their immediate occasion. They continue to mean. Each new reader finds them speaking to something in their own present tense, not just as historical artifacts but as living language. But it is also, perhaps, because of the story. Because of the particular shape of Lincoln's life and death, the rise from poverty, the long struggle, the great achievement, the violent end at the moment of triumph. This shape has the quality of myth. Not myth in the dismissive sense, meaning something untrue, but myth in the deeper sense, a pattern of events that organizes meaning, that answers the questions a culture cannot stop asking. And at the center of the myth, haunting it, giving it its particular quality of shadow and depth, is the dream. The dream of the East Room has never stopped being discussed. It was written about in the years immediately following Lincoln's assassination, in the memoirs and reminiscences of those who had heard Lincoln tell it. It was examined by the first generation of Lincoln biographers, who found in it different things depending on their own beliefs and orientations. The religiously inclined found prophetic revelation. The scientifically inclined found anxiety and coincidence. The literarily inclined found something in between, the kind of meaning that resists reduction to either category. Ward Lamon's account of the dream, which remains the most detailed and closest to primary source we have, was published in 1895, 30 years after Lincoln's death. Lamon had been carrying the memory of it all those years. He had watched his friend die having failed to protect him, and the dream was part of that weight, the warning he had received and passed on and that had not been heeded. His account is not sensational. It is precise and sober and carries the quality of a man bearing witness to something he cannot explain but cannot deny. Mary Lincoln's references to the dream and her correspondence were more emotional, more explicitly interpretive. She returned to it repeatedly as evidence of something she believed deeply, that Lincoln had known. That he had been granted knowledge of what was coming. That this knowledge was real and meaningful, even if its meaning could not be fully articulated. There have been, over the decades since, many attempts to explain Lincoln's prophetic experiences through the lens of whatever psychological or neurological framework was current at the time of the explanation. In the late 19th century, some writers invoked the spiritualist tradition Lincoln as a natural medium, sensitive to dimensions of reality invisible to ordinary perception. In the early 20th century, Freudian analysis had its turn, the dream as wish fulfillment, as death drive, as subconscious expression of a martyrdom fantasy. In later decades, more sophisticated neurological frameworks were applied, the hyperactive pattern recognition of a high-anxiety mind, the confabulation of memory and fear into predictive imagery. None of these explanations is entirely wrong. None of them is entirely adequate. The dream resists being fully housed in any single framework, which is perhaps why it has continued to be discussed. It occupies that uncomfortable border territory where the explicable and the inexplicable look at each other across a line that neither can quite cross. What we can say with confidence is this: Lincoln had the dream. He told it. It was witnessed. And 10 days later, the scene it described was exactly reproduced in the East Room of the White House, in every essential detail. What we can also say is that Lincoln seems to have received this dream not with terror but with a kind of watchful seriousness. He did not run from it. He did not pretend it was nothing. He did not allow it to paralyze him. He took it in, and he held it, and he continued. This quality of continuing, of going on in the face of knowledge or suspected knowledge of terrible things, is perhaps the most characteristically Lincolnian thing about the entire story. It is what he had always done. He had continued after his mother died. After his sister died. After and Rutledge died. After Eddie died. After Willie died. After every battle that went wrong, every general who failed, every month of the war that brought new catastrophes and new lists of the dead. He had simply kept going. Not because he was insensitive to what he had lost. Because he was deeply, carefully committed to the work in front of him, and because he understood that the work would not do itself. The last day of his life, April 14, 1865, was a working day. He received visitors. He wrote letters. He attended the cabinet meeting where he described the ship dream. He spoke at length about Reconstruction, about the plans he had for the defeated Southern states, about the particular kind of generosity he wanted to bring to the process of bringing the country back together. He spoke about mercy. He spoke about the future. He went to the theater and he watched a comedy and he laughed. And at 10:15 in the evening, the thing that the dream had shown him arrived. There is a particular kind of courage in that. In knowing, or half-knowing, or deeply suspecting, and continuing anyway. In not retreating from the world because the world is dangerous. In not closing the doors against the night simply because something in the night has shown you what the night contains. Lincoln had spent his entire life practicing this courage. The dream of the East Room was only the last occasion for it. Not because he was reckless, he had considered the risk and made a calculation, however imperfect, but because to have retreated, to have closed off, to have lived behind walls, would have meant becoming something other than what he was. And he seems to have felt, with great clarity, that what he was mattered. That the specific qualities he brought to his position, the patience, the humor, the capacity for compassion, the deep rhetorical intelligence, were what the moment required. And that he could not preserve those qualities and also protect himself in all the ways that full protection would have required. He chose, in other words, to remain Lincoln. At whatever cost. The cost was everything. The cost was the East Room and the soldiers and the weeping crowds, exactly as the dream had shown him. And the result, though he could not see it, could not know it, was not alive to witness what his death made possible and what it prevented and what it transformed. The result was a myth. A story. A presence that never quite left. In the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., completed in 1922, Daniel Chester French's great marble statue sits in its contemplative gravity, looking down the long axis of the reflecting pool toward the Washington Monument and the Capitol Dome. The face is the face from the photographs, the deep-set eyes, the heavy brow, the lines of long, accumulated sorrow. The hands are enormous and expressive, one clenched and one open, a detail that sculptors and art historians have argued over for a century. Millions of people have stood before that face and felt something they did not entirely expect to feel. Something that goes beyond historical interest or civic reverence. Something more like recognition. As if the face is familiar not because they have seen the photographs but because the qualities it represents, patience, endurance, compassion, the willingness to hold contradiction without breaking, are qualities they themselves have needed and sought. Lincoln became, in death, a national mirror. A place where the country looks when it wants to see what it might be at its best. This is not fair to the historical man, who was complicated and limited and mistaken in various ways, like all humans in all eras. But it is true that what he represented, the idea of a democracy that could survive its worst self-divisions, that could hold together through catastrophe, that could emerge on the other side of a terrible war with the aspiration to reconciliation rather than vengeance, was real. He actually represented it. He actually lived it. The words were not just words. And at the beginning of all of it, or at the end of it, depending on where you begin, is the dream. The man lying in the borrowed bed that was too short for him, at the edge of sleep or the edge of waking, moving through the familiar halls of the White House to the sound of distant weeping. Coming to the East Room. Seeing the body on the catafalque. Asking the soldier who is there, who is dead. Being told, the president. And waking in the dark with a heart that was doing something unusual, and lying still for a while, and then going to breakfast and telling his wife and his friends what the night had shown him. Not with drama. Not with panic. With the careful, deliberate, somewhat wondering honesty of a man who had always paid attention to what the dark hours delivered. The ship was still on the water. The dark and indefinite shore was still ahead. He had 10 more days. He used them well. Closing meditation. Let the story settle now, the way a stone settles through still water. Slowly. Without urgency. Coming to rest in the quiet dark below. We have traveled a long way tonight. Through the log cabins of Indiana and the mud streets of Washington. Through the grief of a man who never stopped grieving and never stopped working. Through the bright light of a theater box and the long dark hours of a borrowed room where history completed itself in the early morning. And through a dream. Always through the dream. There is something we carry home from this story, something quiet and worth keeping. It is not exactly a lesson, because the story is too big and too strange for lessons to contain. It is more like a quality. A way of being with what cannot be controlled or predicted or protected against. Lincoln had the dream and he told it and he continued. He did not close himself against what the night had shown him. He did not pretend it was nothing. He held it, carefully and honestly, and he went on doing what he was there to do. There is something in that for all of us. In the quieter, smaller versions of the same question that every life eventually asks. What do you do when the dream shows you something true and difficult? What do you do when the night whispers something you cannot quite bear to hear in daylight? Perhaps what Lincoln did. You tell it to someone you trust. You hold it honestly. And then you go to breakfast and eat your eggs and do the work that is in front of you, with as much care and kindness as you can manage. The night is quiet now. Your body is heavy and soft in the darkness. Let the images from this story drift and dissolve the way all images do as sleep draws closer, the East Room, the catafalque, the soldiers, the burning barn, the funeral train moving slowly through the April countryside while farmers stood at the tracks with their hats in their hands. Let it all grow soft at the edges. Feel the weight of your limbs. Feel the warmth where you are resting. Notice the sound of your own breathing, which is slow and even and steady, the oldest rhythm there is. Somewhere tonight, the Lincoln Memorial sits in its floodlit stillness above the dark reflecting pool. The marble face looks calmly forward into the distance. The deep-set eyes that carry all that accumulated sorrow are open, as they have always been open, looking out across the long water toward the lighted dome of the capital. But that is out there, far away, in the lit world beyond sleep. Here, now, in the dark where you are, there is only quiet. There is only the slow, soft tide of the breath going in and going out. The world outside is doing whatever it does. The news can wait. The questions can wait. The morning will come when it comes. For now, there is only this: the darkness, the warmth, the breathing. And somewhere in the deep country of the sleeping mind, a ship moves through dark water toward a shore that is distant and indefinite and perhaps not so frightening as it seemed. Sleep well. Sleep well. If you're still awake, that's okay. Just close your eyes and let the story carry you. Subscribe to History for Sleep for a new story every week. Sweet dreams.